So he get the whole family in the taxi. I remember running. I said, just can I take my doll? I love to take this little doll with me. And he said, just run and get it.
In addition to fighting all the legal battles, they have to fight a survival battle to be able to have water, to be able to have power, to be able to do anything.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We begin with a trailer for the new film Voices Across the Divide. It's directed in part by Alice Rothchild, a Jewish American woman, but mostly it's accounts by Palestinians who were driven from their homes in 1948 or in 1967. The film was shown at Yale Law School, and I was privileged to interview Alice Rothchild for a few minutes after the event. Then Shelly Altman speaks about the trip he went on with the Interfaith Peace Builders, a trip of the West Bank of Palestine, and about a book he read upon his return, which delves into the true reason why a group of Palestinians left their home in Safaria.
How do you understand history? Who controls the message? Is the media muzzled, lazy, confused, manipulated? How do you create personal and political change? I invite you to join me in exploring one of the most pressing and complex issues of our day.
In 1948, there was a lot of fighting around our house.
My eldest sister was shot.
A bullet come over our heads.
In 1967, I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell.
After the '67 war, if you weren't physically in the place where you were, you had no right to live in that place.
They're Palestinians, refugees.
This can't go on for much longer. People's eyes are beginning to open to what Israel's doing.
My name is Alice Rothchild, and I was born in 1948 in Boston. I'm an American Jew, interestingly enough, born the same year that the State of Israel was founded. My parents were first-generation Americans who instilled in us a sense that Jews were a distinct and often endangered tribe. This Jewishness soon became grounded in our love for Israel. But as I grew up, I realized I had never actually met an Arab before, and I only knew one side of this complex historical narrative. Starting in the 1990s, I began an active search for the voices that I had never heard, meeting and listening to dissenting Israelis, Palestinians, other Arabs in the United States. And then in 2003, I started co-organizing delegations to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and meeting with Israelis and Palestinians in the region. I began to hear the enormous human commonalities between Arabs and Jews. And I also had to confront the trauma and the fear that pulses in my own Jewish DNA. Based on these experiences, I wrote a book, and then I began collecting stories of Palestinians who had come to the United States. I knew that May 14, 1948 was the glorious day that the State of Israel was founded. This was a victory over anti-Semitism and the Nazi Holocaust. For Palestinians, that day is called Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The interviews with Palestinians that I will share with you in this film are the invisible voices that we have never heard. They are the other part of our story.
I come from a village called Al-Qubab. It's one of those villages, the 400 and some that in 1948 were totally demolished. I lived through the exodus from the village in late April, early May 1948.
It happened when I'm younger. I remember it exactly When in 1948, my father came home and he told my mother that there is a neighbor across the street from us was killed. And he said, by the evening, by 6 o'clock, we have to go. So he get the whole family in the taxi. I remember running. I said, just can I take my doll? I love to take this little doll with me. And he said, just run and get it. And my mom, she has a baby, 15 days old. So she grabbed her jewelry, wrap it in the receiving blanket of the baby, and she throws all in the car, and we left.
For centuries in Eastern Europe, Jews were victimized by anti-Semitism and pogroms, and this all culminated in the Nazi Holocaust. So for Jews, being victimized by an outside Christian culture, it's part of our core identity. We all feel like we all experienced the Holocaust and we all survived the Holocaust. For Palestinians, the Nakba is also a huge catastrophe. But for Palestinians, there has never been an opportunity to have closure on this trauma.
I've just come back from Yale Law School, where we saw the film Voices Across the Divide that was partially directed by Alice Rothchild, so we're going to talk a little bit about it and about herself. You're a doctor, and how did you come out about making a movie?
Sort of by accident. I'm a doctor and a writer, and I had written a book called Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, and I was touring with the book. And I realized that whenever there were Palestinians in the audience, they would want to interrupt me and tell me their stories. So I had this idea I should write another book about the stories that Palestinians tell me, a Jewish woman, which was kind of an interesting dynamic for me. So I was in Detroit doing some book touring, and I set up some interviews because it's a place where there are a big Arab population. And someone told someone who told someone who told the cameraman that I was doing this, and he called me from San Francisco and said, this should be a film. And I said, no, I'm a gynecologist, I don't make films. And he arrived the next day and started following me around. So I left Detroit and Ann Arbor with all of this footage that was very powerful. And gradually, with the support of a film professor at Boston College, I came to the conclusion that I actually had to learn how to make a movie. So I'm the producer, and I co-directed it with Sharon Mullally, who's a filmmaker, and she has a wonderful film company in Philadelphia called Extended Play. So we worked together for 4.5 years. Making
4.5 years?
Yeah.
All right, and it's quite good, quite interesting, and giving a lot of the Palestinian experiences being expelled in 48. I'm going to jump. What does your family think of this? What does your Jewish family think of a film a lot about Palestinians?
Well, it depends who in my family you're talking about. My parents are no longer with us, but my mother was supportive of me, but she always said I took it further than she could bear. My sister is totally supportive, and my brother is gingerly supportive. I have 2 cousins who are supportive, but the rest of my family, we can't even talk about this. In fact, I have the wife of a cousin who once sent out a New Year's Eve message, a New Year's message on Yom Kippur that said peace will come when Arab mothers love their children as much as Jewish mothers love their children. So I have that kind of family. So this is not a topic we can even touch.
Now, when was the first time you went to Israel?
I was 14.
And at that time, you were totally uncritical, I assume.
I was in love with this fabulous place. And, you know, I was very typical of my generation. And it was a total love affair. And I was thrilled with the soldiers and with the Dead Sea and with kibbutzim and Jerusalem. And I still have the diary I kept. And in fact, it's in my book. I quote from my diary because I wanted a real sense of where I came from, and to have this diary that I actually wrote myself was about as valid as I could get. So it was a magical place, and I felt like I'd come home.
Did you ever read that novel by LouAnn Uri's Exodus?
I was exposed to the movie. I didn't read the novel. But
I know. I read that a million times as a young Jewish boy. Now, when was the next time you went to Israel?
So the next time I went to Israel was in 2004. And at that point, I had been involved in organizing a health and human rights delegation in 2003. And then in 2004, I actually went on the delegation. So that was a time when I was involved with working with Israeli activists and Palestinians in the West Bank and in Israel, and crossing lines that when I was 14 I'd never even heard of, so I didn't even know there were lines to cross. And we were focused on what was going on in healthcare at that point, because we had been trying to talk about this issue in our community in Boston and had been basically blacklisted from any public events. So we had this idea that if we were talking about healthcare, I mean, everybody has got to agree that no matter who you are, you deserve prenatal care, and if you're a kid, you shouldn't be anemic, and all those kind of issues. So we thought, well, maybe if we looked at healthcare and then asked why are there such discrepancies between, for instance, healthcare in the West Bank and healthcare at Hadassah Hospital, we could start opening minds about the impact of the occupation.
Have you been back since?
I've been back almost every year.
Did you get harassed?
Going in or coming out?
Well, you describe it.
I have not been harassed going in, but I do present myself as a lovely Jewish lady coming to visit Israel. I once was harassed going out and, taken away for extra interrogation, but, it was freaky and scary, but it's nothing like my Palestinian friends get.
Yeah, we've heard the stories of the terrible interrogations people get.
Yeah, and people get strip searched. I mean, just really awful things. And our delegation, if we have a Palestinian American on our delegation, we know they're going to get, if they even go through Ben Gurion Airport, they're going to get held for 6-8 hours of interrogation before they come through, and they have American passports. So it's a very, there's a lot of profiling that goes on.
And not just Arabs. Now we've heard African Americans, for some reason, are getting special treatment, let's say.
No, I traveled with an African American civil rights delegation last year, the year before last, and also had a woman from Jamaica on a trip last year, and she was treated in an unusual fashion at checkpoints in a way that I, as a white person, a white Jewish person, wasn't treated. So it's a very complex society when it comes back to profiling.
I want to talk about just two more things. You get into boycotts, divestments, and sanctions in the movie. Could you just talk about that a bit? Well,
what I did with the movie was that I interviewed Palestinians and asked them, what are you doing? And Diana Boutou, who is a Canadian Palestinian who now lives in Ramallah and is a lawyer, talked about the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Movement. And so this is a call from the Palestinian Civil Society that came out in 2005, although there's been a lot of BDS activity for decades in the region, asking for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of companies, for instance, that profit from the occupation or they're involved in the occupation. There's an academic boycott, a cultural boycott. It's using a South African model, even though what's going on there is different than South Africa. There are enough similarities in terms of apartness, and it's a nonviolent resistance movement, and I think it's very important to respect the call.
Well, I want to thank you for talking to me.
You're welcome.
Alice Rothchild is eager to get her film shown, maybe even to bring it to you. See her website, voicesacrossthedivide.com. Now for Shelly Altman.
I was born on June 11th, 1948, in Israel Zion Hospital in Brooklyn, and was bar mitzvahed in Mar 11 Jewish War Veterans Memorial Hall, also in Brooklyn, about 51 years ago. And then I had a gap of about 50 years in my Jewish education, and it's picked up again in the last year or so. The immensity and intensity of the trip, I have to echo what Ali said. The delegations that IFPB runs are incredible, both before, during, and after. The quality of the preparation, the quality of the orientation, just before you go, the people that you meet, the variety is just stunning, and also the support and encouragement that you get to be active when you come back. What I'd like to do is focus on, because it's such a large thing to talk about, I'd like to focus on a couple of small things that hit me. One of them while I was on the delegation, and then one once I came back. I've been doing a lot of reading, and I want to sort of get into that a little bit. So one of the places that we went to is a place called Tent of Nations, which Tent of Nations is an educational and environmental farm on a hillside outside of Bethlehem. And it's really, the Tent of Nations is actually on a farm that was purchased by a Palestinian family, the Nasser family, in 1916. The farm is now surrounded by 5 Israeli settlements. When we arrived at the farm, we came to a road, and the road was blocked by a set of boulders. And the boulders, it wasn't quite clear whether the boulders were placed by the Israeli Defense Force or by the settlers who were the neighbors of, quote-unquote neighbors of the farm. But in any case, it basically blocks the road to the farm, and it's illegal to remove the boulders. So if you remove them, then, you know, that's illegal. So we all had to hike in along the road for about a half mile or a mile up to the farm with the settlements all around. The farm over the years has grown olives, pomegranates, olives, figs. It's been one thing after the next. They've used all sorts of techniques, legal techniques, harassment techniques. The settlers have been part of this by harassing them. But that's one face of it. But the other face is that the Nasser family, and I think this is very dangerous to Israel, because what the Nasser family has refused to back down. And they, at every single step of the way, they have fought every legal battle. They have, they basically managed to keep their land. They actually had written title to it from 1916, which is very unusual for Palestinian farmers to have title to their land. But they did have title from the Ottoman era, and that made it somewhat more possible for them to fight their battle. But the other face of it is that what they've done is they've started this Tent of Nations program, which is they have children come to the farm, and they have arts programs, creative writing, drama. They teach them environmental activities and basically connect the kids with the land. And so, in addition to fighting the battle and setting an example to keep their land, surrounded by all this hostility, they have really set an example.
There's a settlement.
That
one settlement.
This is a settlement, and if you back up to this, this is a catch basin for water. This is a 6-inch high wall to trap the water. This is illegal. The Israelis could come in and demolish this catch basin because it was built without a building permit. You have to have a building permit. The Palestinians have to have building permits for any construction that they do in what's called the Zone C area of the West Bank. And I won't get into the details of what Zone C is, but and so in addition to fighting all the legal battles, they have to fight a survival battle to be able to have water, to be able to have power, to be able to do anything to survive on their land and to farm it. And yet, in the face of all that, they're not only surviving, but bringing in people, getting the word out, and having these programs to bring forth the next generations with feeling empowered and educated about the land. I'll end with this part by saying we were hosted by a woman, Amal Nasser, who I believe is Dawood's sister. Do you know?
I'm not sure. Mike, do you know?
That's right.
Yeah.
Dawood's sister. And Amal took us around the farm, and she said there were 2 things that she said that really appealed to me. One was that their principle is that if you uproot 10 trees, 10 olive trees, we'll plant 20 more. And the things she said in parting about this is, if we knew the world was ending tomorrow, we'd go out and plant an olive tree. So that's one of my experiences of many in Palestine. The next thing I'd like to talk about comes from one of several books that I've read about the area and its history since I returned, and I've been doing a lot of reading. It's sort of part of my personal journey. The book is My Happiness Bears No Relation to Happiness. It's written by a woman who is an American Jewish woman who lives in Israel, Adina Hoffman, and it's a biography of a very well-respected Palestinian poet, Taha Muhammad Ali, not a boxer, a poet. Taha was, his parents, Abu Taha and his mother Ima Taha, were born, they were married very young. I think she was 15. He's their fifth child. The first one was named Taha and died after a couple of years. The second one was Taha, he also died. After the second child died, the mother was renamed because they thought maybe perhaps her name was problematic, and so they renamed her to Nijma. Had another son, Taha, who also died. Then they decided, well, maybe we need to name the child differently, and so they named the next child Milad, which is birth. And Milad also passed away as a child. And so after having the 4 children, they were devastated, and they decided that maybe what they needed to do was move to a different location. And so they had lived with Abu Taha's family in a one-room home in the Palestinian village of Safaria, which was in the Galilee, doesn't exist anymore. So they built a house on some land that the family had and moved in and conceived another Taha. And this Taha is the one whose biography this is. This Taha survived. The father, Abu Taha, had polio when he was a child, and he was crippled and really couldn't do any physical labor, and so it was hard for the family to have any income. He was very well respected in the community, but he didn't really have any income, and was finding he had to sell off land in order to keep the family going. And so Taha, the child, was a very enterprising young boy, and started a stand selling things outside of his family's home. And he did this for a while. He established relationships with local merchants, and after a period of time had gotten enough money to invest in some goats. So he had a flock of goats, and I'd like to read to you from the book. One night, as he was after eating, he washed his hands and face, then set out in the dark with his bleeding new investment to wander those same hills. The floppy-eared flock was restless and threatening to eat Taha's garden, his mom's garden, so he decided to take the goats out to the house of the man who had grazed them the next day. Following the dirt path that ran beside the bayiter, he walked for about 5 minutes, and it was then that he heard an odd, low sound, something circling in the air above. As it lifted to a whistle, then mounted to a roar, he saw a brilliant flash, felt a crash and tremor, and another. Then everything was smashing glass and rising smoke, shouts in the distance, wailing nearby, people running, children crying, the 16 kids yelping in terror as they scattered. So this was the beginning of this was an Israeli invasion of his village in July of 1948. The reason I bring this up is because there are the idea of having many narratives to one event in this area is very common. There's an Israeli narrative, a Palestinian narrative. Different people say different things. It's hard to know what really happened. In this particular case, the Israelis, even the people years later who were part of the Israeli invasion force, insisted that they had invaded, and by the time that they came to the village, there was nobody left, that the Palestinians had vacated their village because, for whatever reason, they weren't there anymore, and they had left voluntarily. And the Palestinians said, no, we were bombed. We were bombed from the air. We knew what the Israelis had done to other villages, and we felt we had to leave to survive. We thought of Deir Yassin, which was a village near Jerusalem, in which there was which was a mass murder a couple of months before that. And so that's what the Palestinians said. The author, Adina Hoffman, was totally confused by, on the one hand, people whom she respected and who had a lot of credibility, saying this couldn't possibly have happened. There were no airstrikes, and Palestinians saying no, we were bombed. So she did a lot of research, and she somehow miraculously was able to get into the Israeli records at an Israeli army base called, see if I can remember the name of it here. I'm sorry about this. I don't remember the name of it. I think it's Tel HaShomer, near outside of Tel Aviv. And she finally gets to the place where she thinks there's going to be where there might be records of it. And she says, at the sight of the first flight report, I gasped audibly and punctured the hush of the chilly room. Here is all the ink I could possibly ask for. The name of the pilot, Moshe. The type of plane, Oster. The hour of the airfield takeoff, 21:25, and the precise time that the 4 bombs were dropped on Safaria. The size of the bombs is mentioned, the fact that there were fires cited. And so it was that the villagers of Safaria did not flee because the army outwitted their defenders on the ground, or because they were cowardly or weak, or told by their leaders to do so. They fled because a pair of Israeli Air Force planes pummeled them with bombs from on high, sending up flames and sending down mayhem. And so I feel like this, you know, it really sort of corroborates that you really have to dig pretty deep and really get to the bottom of things to understand what's going on in that part of the world, and understand that there's lots of ways of hearing about things, and there is a truth, and that's something that's really sort of coming to me as I go on my journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm supposed to introduce.
We'll hear from others who went on the trip on future programs. Altman was inspired by his travels to join with others to form a Connecticut chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. If you're interested in that group, contact Altman at the email that you see on our screen. You may recall that in September, I talked to former U.S. soldier and diplomat Ann Wright. We talked about Gaza's Ark. Well, she went with several people from Code Pink to Switzerland to try to get a women's perspective added to the negotiations that were supposed to settle the Syrian conflict. I did an interview with her. You can listen to it on our website, thestruggle.org. Finally, 2 cartoons from Latouche. The first about the great achievements of George W. Bush in Iraq. The second about the neo-Nazi right inside the Ukraine. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.